A2IM, the collective voice of independent music.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great A2IM Indiescussion. My name is Evan Plick. I'm the membership manager here at A2IM. And today we've got untapped revenue sources for labels in gaming, talking about various monetization, exposure, and fan engagement opportunities for... Sorry, there's a delay with YouTube as well. Monetization, exposure, and fan engagement opportunities for both independent labels and artists in the gaming space, as well as just broader synergies between gaming and music. So two quick plugs before I hand it over to our great speakers today. The first, if you are not a member of A2IM but interested in joining or just hearing a bit more about what we do, you can reach myself and the rest of the membership team at membership@a2im.org, and we will get you set up. I'll also put that in the chat afterwards. And the second is a quick word from our sponsor, the Clio Awards. So A2IM member, the Clio Awards host Clio Music and other industry programs celebrating creativity in the advertising and marketing. If your artists are partnering with cannabis, hemp, or CBD brands, check out Clio Cannabis, celebrating the best in cannabis marketing. For more, head over to cliocannabisawards.com prior to the October 9th deadline for entries. And with that, I will hand it over to our moderator, Heather Johnson, CEO at 99 Lives. So Heather, take it away.
Hi. Thanks again, Evan, for, and A2IM for putting this together. I'm the CEO of 99 Lives, and I work with A2IM with advocacy, and I come from the gaming industry, so my goal is to try to kind of bridge that gap and really bring the music and gaming industries together. I think there's tons of opportunity. So I'd love to introduce our panelists. First, we have Mary Kate from Materia Collective. Mary Kate, I'd love for you to just explain a little bit of who you are and what you do.
Hi, thanks, Heather. So I'm currently head of music and publishing operations with Materia Collective. And we're an independent label and music publisher for music that's from and focused on the video game industry. So helping to represent composers and game studios and other rights holders of the music that was created for video games and integrating it with the music industry. So before that, I was involved in the mechanical rights side and performing rights side of the music industry. So it's been fun to bring that background more focused on video games and how to make that side of the industry have a broader reach.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge. And likewise, we also have Chase with us, who is a composer and has been working and sound engineer and has been working with the video game space for quite some time. Chase, I would love for you to take a moment and just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do.
Hey, I'm Chase Bethea. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, A2IM. I'm a freelance video game composer, and I write music for video games, as the title suggests. And I've been working in the industry for about 9 years, shipped about 18 titles in that time, and also in affiliation with Materia Collective to help get the music out there a little bit more with the publishing side of things. But typically, I'm just trying to write the ear candy for those happy players out there who love the video games as much as I do.
Awesome. So let's get started. I think one of the most, important components here is just kind of your journey, right? So Mary Kate, you talked a little bit about your journey where you started, but I think that's a lot of us have questions like, how'd you end up in video games, right? So what is your background and your history, and how did you get where you got?
Oh gosh, well, like many people, it's a little bit all over the place. So initially when I studied music, I was focused on composing and songwriting, and then specifically always had been interested in video games and films and other media where music was created specifically for the media. And so after studying, then I ended up going into the publishing and administrative side of the music business, but always kept that focus on the side of, well, there's all this great music in games that's really not being compensated properly. Composers aren't able to exploit their rights as much as they could just because there's kind of a disconnect between those two sides. And then Materia Collective, which is a relatively young company, recently formed, and I had the opportunity to come on board and provide some assistance with exploiting those rights, helping composers to make sure all the songs are properly registered, that their masters are properly registered in places. So it's really a lot of legwork that many people don't have time to do. So that's been a lot of fun. I think you're still muted.
I know, the mute button, hot and fast, the mute button today. Chase, I'm actually also very curious about like how you ended up in as a composer working with video game developers.
Yeah, so I bought this book called The Complete Guide to Game Audio by Aaron Marks sometime around 2011. By this time, I was already kind of deep into my second degree for composition, which I was studying at Moore Park College, and I had decided I was going to be a video game composer when I was at this time here. Considering that I already went through a recession period, I was already a live sound engineer, and I was already writing music for things like I had already been working in the industry professionally, but the recession caused a furlough. I went back to school, and then I got into the applied program for like music and got better at classical composition and piano and all that stuff. But I bought that book during my time, and before I had said to myself, before I go to the next step, which is university for like, out of community college, then I would, at my last theory class, I would definitely start writing for projects. And so when that book talked about like going to GDC, which is Game Developers Conference, or going to conferences in general, meeting people, networking. And then it also talked about having an online presence. And so I saw like a couple websites that were listed in the book, and this was halfway through the book, and I closed the book. I start posting my work on there because I had already been told from the decade before that my music sounds like it should be in video games by all my peers and friends, and I didn't know how to do that, and I didn't think about how to research it until I saw a couple videos. But when I started posting on the online for different, I think the website was like dev.net, and developers were posting their projects, and I put my music up there, and then I got a pitch to do stuff, audition, and landed the gig. And I've been just doing game jams and doing more persistence, going through school, learning and refining my craft to get where I am today.
I've done a couple of game jams. They're absolutely amazing experiences. It's like the ultimate study session if you all just want to develop a game in a single night or over a couple nights. A lot of caffeine. So, given your background, like how important of a role do you feel like music is in the gaming industry across the board, like in the game itself, but background, huge component like Beat Saber, where it's like the main piece of the game across the board? Like how important do you feel it is?
I mean, I feel like it's extremely important. If you think about playing a game without any type of music whatsoever, or if you even were playing arcades and you went to your arcade and didn't hear any sound or any music, you wouldn't be able to recognize Street Fighter themes. You wouldn't be able to recognize the Skyrim themes in the other room if your siblings or your parents even were playing. Think about just playing Mario on silent, just the most popular game in the entire world. That's at least 50% of the experience, right? If you can sonically identify something before seeing it, and that's very powerful. And these are also things like I can speak to this as myself, whereas in this also has a huge sense of nostalgia, and this brings up childhood good memories typically, because there are a lot of things in the world that you just want to escape from, and video games and video game music specifically carry those good memories for people, as well as other songs that do things outside of the video game music, but it just empowers it and enhances it a lot more. It's a part of the entire collaborative art form, and I think that's just really impactful and paramount to consider.
I feel the same. I feel like no game would be the same if I didn't have like the background music or those recognizable themes. Mario is a huge one for me. It's my entire childhood. So and and that kind of goes along lines of like so what might be different about composing a song for a game than per se maybe a movie, or even like things like commercial spots and et cetera, when they have like the use case is slightly different, but like in a game, how would that experience be different?
Yeah, it's extremely different. You're thinking about player mechanics with jumping and exploring different areas and things that are very ambiguous to the play style of how you play or how Mary Kate plays or anyone plays. And it's always going to be a little bit different because we make different decisions and choices. And so the music is going to be sometimes interactive or non-interactive in that respect, but it's not linear, right? Because a player could be faster at platforming games and get through a level and you never hear the entire score for that one area level, or you were only in a certain part of the town talking to this NPC and that music was, extrapolated for X amount of time, and then you decide not to talk to NPCs just as long as maybe the other person. Versus like in movie, you're on a track, and that track, what the beginning, the middle, and the end is, and you can play it back, and it's always going to be the same every time you play that movie. The same notes are going to happen, the same crescendos, everything that's going on is going to be exactly the same. So you can predict what's kind of going on and study it a little bit easier. Versus within you playing a game, it's always going to be pretty spontaneous, and to align the music to kind of fit that world is the biggest challenge that I like to kind of tackle, along with the technical sound design aspect, in order to enhance that experience even more and give that project that sonic identity, typically just as well as that sonic identity is attached to those films.
Yeah, and hopefully you can hear me a little bit stronger now. If not, let me know. Yeah, so in addition to what Chase said, what's cool about games is that, much like film and TV, the music serves a purpose to enhance the existing media. So it's part of a whole. But with games, you have a whole spectrum of how you can make that happen. So sometimes there are scenes or moments or elements where the music is the focus. You have a full song that gets played uninterrupted, and that can be the focus. And then there are many other ways of integrating the music so it's more interactive. You have things that fade out and come in as you do different things. You have music that's chopped up into different pieces. And this can happen with existing recordings or newly composed music. So there's really just a whole huge spectrum of things you can do in video games with music. Something that I hope we can touch on later is there are whole genres and spectrums of games that use existing music more dynamically. So there's rhythm games, and those are going to be probably of interest to existing catalogs of audio because they tend to use music as the focus of the playability of their games. So there's really like any kind of use of music out there in games, which is what makes them so cool.
I actually would really love to touch on that right now, if that's okay. Because that's a big question that we get from our member bases. How do I get my artists to perform in Fortnite like Travis Scott did, or how do I get my music in Beat Saber? And what does that look like? Because we get descriptions of what a film might need for a particular moment, and then we try to fit our music in there as best as possible, giving a couple different options. But from my understanding is that most game developers don't necessarily work with supervisors, right? So how do you recommend they facilitate those relationships, and how do you find that song? Like, what are things to consider when trying to find the perfect song for a game like that or an opportunity like that?
Well, that's going to be all over the map, but I think the biggest thing to do is, depending on the size of the game studio and the team they're working with, there are actually quite a few folks that might be more in line with this music supervisor role. Most studios have some sort of audio director and who covers all sorts of things from the integration of original music to spot uses of existing music, so in game trailers or in other events. And so from there, it really just depends on the particular need in mind. With rhythm games, it gets a little more interesting because I tend to be on the other side of that, where sometimes we do get requests from smaller games for uses of our catalog. And so in that case, I have less of a sense of who to go looking for, but I imagine that the larger rhythm games do have continual outreach and are constantly looking for more music. So that's always going to be an avenue to look for. But the best way to connect with the audio directors and these departments in the game studios that are always looking for music is in game industry focused events. Right now, it's a little bit disconnected. I would love to see more game industry people attend music side events, but I think right now it tends to be the other direction. So getting music people to come to game events is probably going to be the more direct connections you can make, if that makes sense.
I started with going to PAX and TwitchCon and GDC, and then have recently moved into the music side of things. But again, this year was the first year, and so haven't had an opportunity to go to Indie Week in person. But it sounds like you've frequented some of those events, and like, what are some of the recommendations for just getting to know game developers, what they need, approaching them, and from both? Because my understanding, Chase, is you've also had wonderful opportunities to network in that space.
Yeah, so the best way I've realized to like kind of navigate it is you're just making friends, and you're always showing up every single time if you can afford to. You've got to pick and choose. You've got to balance self-care, all that other stuff. But you will be forgotten if you don't show up quite often as such. So just maybe pick the hot stuff, like you would go to a NAMM and then go to an E3, or just, if you want to go to international, you go to a Gamescom and then maybe go something more local, and go to a PAX, try to switch it up a little bit. But I find that everyone that you meet is in that space is there to have new opportunities to connect with other people. And you're either going to connect with on the music side of things, or you're going to connect with a favorite game that you grew up with, maybe like a deep cut from a PlayStation 1, or you're wearing a Sega shirt or something. Actually, that's a really good opener to like get people to kind of maybe approach you as wear a cool t-shirt, and they were like, oh yeah, I love that band, or I love that game, like, or that's a cool shirt, like who designed it? And that just breaks the ice so much easier than maybe trying to talk to people and get other people's attention and stuff like that. So it's a ton of different myriad of ways that you can be creative about it and go. But during the online stuff, I still think it's good to at least like attend, be in the chat, be in the community, be online, and just say hello, check in with folks, see how people are doing. Just be a human being overall. Be kind, be nice.
Yeah, I personally noticed that, the big stark difference, in my opinion, between networking in the gaming industry, networking in the music industry per se, has been that it's much more about getting to know you and a little bit more casual. And yeah, so you build the friendship, and then from there you start to, pinpoint places where you can work together. But it's very about, disarming, I guess. It's different. Like, Mary Kate, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, networking in the gaming space and going to conferences.
Yeah, of course. I also wanted to bring up that a good thing to do when trying to get some leverage in a game event space is to work with artists that have connection to games. Because, for instance, a lot of game conventions and game events, and this year's a little tough because everything is virtual, but a lot of them have live performances as part of the events, much like other music industry events. And so in this case, it's like, if you can find opportunities for your artists to perform, and especially if they are familiar with game music, they can perform music that's related to games, they can cover their favorite game music. That will also draw attention to your label and your artists, because the music draws the fans, and a lot of game industry folks are just, they're fans first and foremost. So it's really just becoming part of the community and becoming familiar with the kind of music that's used, which in video games is pretty much every kind of music you can imagine. But having some familiarity, if you're looking to meet people at the larger game studios, is knowing what they've done. So for instance, knowing that, this is kind of an outlier example, but knowing that Square Enix used a high-profile cover of Stand By Me for one of their latest games. They had Florence and the Machine cover it, so it was really, that was like the single that led Final Fantasy 15. And so that's a on one end of the spectrum, but a lot of these games are built with music that's meant to draw people together. And so knowing a little bit more about that will help, because it is very much a community-focused industry.
And you also bring up a really interesting example there, because the initial thought is to see what's already been done, right? So we see, Monster Cat gets music in Rocket League, Travis Scott does a performance in Fortnite, and so we jump to like, oh, that's really cool, but how do I do that? But I think there's more than just those types of opportunities. Like you mentioned game trailers, right? And so any other like thoughts or ideas of how labels can, engage with the gaming industry that isn't necessarily, just trying to get an artist to perform in Fortnite, right? There's more, I think.
Yes, if it's okay, I'll jump in on this real quick. So 2 ideas that I've had bouncing around. Heather, we've talked a lot in the past about live streaming. So when players are playing games online and engaging with an audience, there's a lot of opportunity to use all sorts of music with that, in addition to the music that's part of the game that they're streaming. So that's one category. And then another category is growing gigantically fast is esports. So there's a lot of opportunity to have music used in esports events of all shapes and sizes. And that can be something like, so for instance, I'm also a part of the community of artists that regularly covers and arranges music from video games. And it's a little bit of a smaller community, but it's very, very popular. People love it. And so sometimes artists will be approached to create music for these small tournaments or other esports events where they really just like the style of music and they want something to be created for that. And then, of course, you have ESPN. So there's really the whole range of, those are the 2 kind of biggest categories I'm thinking of that are not necessarily limited to the usage in the game, if that's what you're asking.
I think that's another interesting one that I think we sometimes forget, because right now, Sub Pop did a really cool series where they covered existing catalog. They had other artists that are currently active cover music that they released in the past. And, I think that might be kind of a cool concept of like, you take a video game, something that, most of our generation have experienced at some point, and covered it. Like what would, popular artists actually covering, music from a game that, they grew up with, right? So there's lots of cool opportunities. Any other thoughts, like Chase, of like what that would be like if someone covered your music at some point, like Florence and the Machine or some Sub Pop?
First of all, that would be super great, and I would be mostly honored. I've had a couple people do a couple remixes of little things here and there, but not like highly professional and out there for the world to know and stuff like that. But a couple ideas was thinking, I did score a game that never got to see the light of day, unfortunately, but I did score a game it was called Orchestrina. And the premise of the game were these little cubes, and you were in this dark space world. And I'm imagining this in VR now. So I'm taking it like not super future, but present times. But we have these little cubes, and each cube, if you stem out, I wrote the track, whereas the track is already done, but the track needs layers in order for it to feel complete. So these were the band members, and there's black cubes or darker, like darkness, like cubes, similar like Kingdom Hearts, whereas they were trying to stop the band from coming together. But so you've got to kind of use your cube to find the other band members that maybe are playing the synth line that I wrote, or the saxophone line, and then the drums, and then there's all space about the world, and you push and you like use your gravity to push it forward. And the players in that could easily be interactive and more encompassing to like getting it all together to make the entire track once they're all forming together, because then you'll hear everything coming together over placing all the cubes together, of course. And then the sky opens up, and then you have like a different like VR music party, right? Or music VR music release party. I'm just coming up with stuff off the top of my head, expanding on this idea. But I'm just excited to possibly hear something like that, since I'm typically always doing stems of the work that I have, and then having like a release party in that, and then hearing how things come together, or taking little parts away, and then we can just remix it live and do all these cool things. Like there's so much really cool opportunities to imbued into that, and then we can just have a really good space in that field, and then have different like oral experiences as well on top of the music. I think it's pretty interesting.
I think that's kind of the big point, is that, we see some of the big ones that happen, and they get quite a bit of press, but there's just so much that can be done in this space. And I think a lot of it comes from collaborations, right? Like it doesn't always come from the video game dev coming to the musician. Sometimes it comes from the musician, but I think some of the biggest ones we've seen, like the Travis Scott one, has come from, an interest on both sides, right? And it's kind of developed from there into this fully fledged idea that just was unique and fun. And I think that's a huge piece of the gaming industry, is it is very much engaging. That's the difference between movies and games. You're engaging with the platform, and you're engaging with the community, not necessarily just observing it or experiencing it. So what are other ideas that you guys, or recommendations you have for necessarily growing that network with games? Like, oftentimes we cold contact music supervisors. Like, what does that look like with games? Like, Chase, you work with different developers. Like, how do you almost like shop yourself to different game developers? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so I work with a lot of independent developers, and some of them don't necessarily have like a team where there's like a producer and a music supervisor. Sometimes it's just the designer, right? And the designer is creating the game, and they may not be familiar with music rights and other things like that. So that avenue is a little bit more difficult, because they really are in the mindset of having music like in the end of the project, and then maybe like, or I should say, having placeholders. So they're listening to stuff. I was talking to a developer, and they have things on Spotify, and they're listening to certain artists, but they're like placeholders, and then they may or may not use it, obviously with respective licenses. But what I'm saying is, like, they think it might fit in their game, but they're not super sure like how to kind of navigate it. So if I approach them with like a custom thing or something, saying like, hey, I could kind of get close to that, or I could do something similar, then I've got to educate them on rights and such like that. Now, if on the other end, if we're doing a more established studio that has a audio director or a music supervisor or such, they're a little bit more familiar, right? They were composer themselves, or they've worked with audio in some kind of way, and they're in charge of employing someone like me to do more of like that style, or licensing music that I've kind of done already. And that relationship takes a long time because they don't know you, so they don't necessarily trust you right away, and you've got to really impress them. And this is where like you have got to pull out all the stops for creativity, in terms of, because everybody's trying to kind of, they're trying to figure out what's best for the project. And at the end of the day, I think that's something to definitely point out, is that the game is always evolving through development, and sometimes it changes in a complete direction. So you may be in contact with that audio director and be getting a yes. And if they decide from going like a Western Red Redemption style to like a Dead Space style, like, and you don't have any music that kind of fits, you're going to be out of the loop until maybe the next project kind of rolls around. And it's a timing thing too. It's a huge timing thing, because you don't know where they are in development. They may stop, they may take longer. So the navigation is extremely difficult. I'm just going to be transparent, but it's not impossible. I think the persistence and the relationship nourishment needs to be there, in terms of like your follow-ups or your check-ins and such like that, to kind of be in the loop as best as you can, especially now, like if you can't get to anything in person, but you you've got to be on top of it. And I think the more that you at least check in, I found, at least from seeing from my mentor and how he did it, when he was kind of showing me the kind of the ropes of such, like, then you can at least have the conversation going and it being a little bit more fluid, and rather than just kind of being on the outside. But it's a timing thing. It's difficult either way, but it's not impossible.
Likewise, Mary Kate, do you have any like recommendations or suggestions with, expanding your network and, working, because Chase did point out like a really interesting point, like working with an indie developer is different than working with like a Blizzard, right? So any recommendations there?
I guess it would depend on what your goal is ultimately, but I think another good move to take into consideration is to leverage artist contacts. So a lot of times music relationships are made and game industry relationships are made between friends. So I've seen instances where an existing artist who hasn't necessarily been writing music for games has enough networking and relationships with developers, maybe that they know personally, where they want to use that type of music. So they'll recruit those artists to either provide licensed music or create new music for games. And so good ways to do that are, one, if you have in a roster, you have artists that are already connected to the game space, that helps a lot. Recruiting new artists to a label, it might be interesting to find ones that have interacted with the game space in some extent. So kind of build the relationships that way. In addition to things like going to the events and meeting audio directors and meeting developers who are always looking for new music. It's interesting because you have the two sides where you have the people that are looking to create new music for their IP. That's a pretty big element of game culture, is they want music that's associated with their property that will draw people to their games. But then there are a lot of adjacent opportunities to use existing music. So it's still beneficial to create those relationships either way. There are, for instance, I was thinking of this a little earlier, there are cases where a studio that has a game with particularly interesting music, or that they want to focus on the music, they'll release the soundtrack, the original soundtrack. And then maybe they might release an additional album of remixed versions or collaborator versions, like with additional hip hop content or things like that. So you always have opportunities for artists to get involved. And then from there, that's an additional relationship you've built to move forward. So that's an avenue I would consider, because the game community is really insular as far as people are attached to the existing music a lot. So if you've got artists that have interacted with that space, that'll help a lot.
And we talked a little bit about this before the panel, but I think it's worth potentially discussing. What are ways like organizations like A2IM who do events like these that we can potentially incorporate the video game industry a bit more into our events to kind of bridge those gaps?
So there are a couple of different organizations off the top of my head that would be useful. There's a Game Audio Network Guild, which is focused on the audio side of the industry. And then there's independent game developers groups that are more for the smaller size studios and really just networking between game developers of that scope. Those are probably going to be two really good ones to focus on to build those long-lasting relationships. And then in addition to that, gosh, I don't know if there's anything that is kind of towards the higher level of the larger studios. They're probably just interacting with the existing music industry organizations at that point. So obviously those continue to be good groups to belong to.
Chase, you had mentioned that like working with indie games, that there was an education piece, right? That, in indie developers, they may not necessarily understand or know the history of music licensing and what rights they may need. you mind speaking a little bit to that, like what those conversations look like? As 99 Lives, we've had to do it personally, and I think there's an element of patience that's required, and being respectful and understanding that they want to learn, right? They just may not know. So I'd love to hear your history with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It varies from different person. If the programmer or the developer, indie developer, designer has a history with music, it's a little bit easier but they may not get a chance to actually write the music for the game. They're really focused on and passionate about other elements. Maybe they want to focus on, the programming or the writing, and then having an artist and maybe getting better at art. But the ones that are not there, I found that I did a random spontaneous talk at a GDC one time at some kind of like a little event. And I just went up and asked, like, how many people would like to work with a composer but don't know how? And there was a room full of developers, and almost all of them raised their hand. And I was really shocked and I found that they were just fearful. And it was more of it wasn't like a speech. It was like a dialogue that was happening. And they were saying, well, we don't really know where to begin, and we don't know who to talk to. We don't kind of know how it kind of goes. And they're just looking for a gentle hand to guide. And so I found, like, I've taken music business classes just because my mom has told me, like, hey, you want to be up on your game in terms of the knowledge and the experience for certain things, because labels have this knowledge and you just want to be well versed with that. And so with having that experience and bringing that forward to developers, I found that it's a little bit easier to have the conversation rather than them trying to look it up themselves, because they get overwhelmed and they are going to be they don't want to focus on that part. They barely want to focus on the marketing of music in the first place, marketing their game, and then music is always like a second afterthought for some reason. But if you can just make the experience a little bit better and saying, hey, well, if you want to do this type of music licensing, it'll be non-exclusive. Non-exclusive means, it's not, indirect for you owning it, in the sense I retain the rights, et cetera, et cetera. Exclusive meaning, excuse me. Sorry about that. Exclusive meaning, you kind of work for hire, you're buying out more outright, it's going to cost a little bit more. You don't want to say that because then they're probably not going to go that route. But at least if they're educated, then they have an idea of what the cost is, and they're not thinking of how cheap and devalued it is over that they can just access it anywhere, which is the biggest issue I'm seeing a lot still, which is like just music being undervalued and not being educated at the appreciation of what it's really worth and what it, and along with how it can enhance and expand. Like they're thinking of more of like, oh, that's too much and I'm going to go the cheap route, but they're missing the fact of it's going to help your game. Again, it's 50% of the experience. It's going to help. It's not going to distract from it because you didn't invest in yourself. It's like, did you decide that you wanted to put bad stuff in your body and then grow, or did you want to put good stuff in your body and be healthy? And it's the exact same thing. You're creating something. It's yours, and it's just this disconnect. But again, it's more of educating yourself first as much as you can to then facilitate that information to them. And like you said, with a patient and a kind and more understanding flow, so that everybody's more on like the same page. And then again, like if it's not for everybody, then it's not for everybody, but at least you got the information out there so they know what it's worth and how to kind of go about it. And sometimes they'll come back and ask more questions because they are genuinely curious and they do want that end goal to make it better. They do want their project to be the best it can be. They do want to collaborate with a specific artist or a specific composer and have that be at its maximum, because not everybody can be, Hans Zimmer, you're great, but not everybody can be Hans Zimmer. And all the game developers want Hans Zimmer quality, but they don't know like what the licensing fees and how that stuff kind of goes and things like that. So it just they just seem to like kind of fade away because it's just not out there enough for the information to be receiving and more understanding to what they can do.
I kind of pose the same question, Mary Kate. Like, what is your experience with kind of educating game developers, even on the other side, right? Like they get the music, they commission it, and you guys are huge advocates for making sure it's released and made available on like public channels. And so, how do you educate them on that side of the value of the music that they've commissioned?
Well, it's always a work in progress, but yes, that is our primary goal, is really just to make sure that the rights holders, which can either be the studios and developers or composers themselves, depending on how that deal shakes out for each game. But either way, there's rights that can be exploited that just many of times, the developers are focused on making the games and marketing the games, and they don't have a lot of time to do the legwork on the music side. They're not familiar with how that works within the music industry. So that's really what we offer as a partner to those game studios. So what we try to do is mainly just make ourselves present at game industry events to talk about that. And I would love to see that expanded and have other music industry presence at game-focused events, just really to provide information to developers who are looking to know about this, because it's mostly just a lack of time and a lack of initiative. It's not their focus. And without putting in that work, it's hard to see the value of those opportunities. So yeah, that's essentially a big part of what I do, is to provide value. And through that, through the previous work that we've done, then showing other developers, oh, this is worth exploring, But it's an uphill battle in a lot of cases.
I think there's quite a bit of education that we're working to resolve with panels such as these, and on both sides, right? Making sure the video game industry really understands the value of music and what rights they need, but also what the value is inherently even after they may have commissioned or signed a track. And especially like in promotional opportunities. And the same thing with the music industry, making sure they understand that it's more than just getting your music in a game. There's game trailers, there's game events. We're at the Tiltify booth a couple years at TwitchCon, and they needed music for their live event that they did. And so there's so much opportunity, I think, between the industries. So we're kind of nearing the end of everything. I keep an eye out for any questions, but do you guys have any other last thoughts that maybe we just didn't touch on that you think would be really valuable for the music industry in regards to working with the video game industry? I kind of put you on the spot.
I don't think so. I think we touched on most of the stuff I noted. I did want to mention that when you asked about organizations earlier, I remembered the name of the group I was looking up. It's International Game Developers Association. IGDA is a big one on the game dev side. So primarily focused on representation for developers. But that's a big one in addition to the Game Audio Network Guild. So, but yeah, I think it's tough. They're very, the games industry is pretty community focused and really just want people to engage. So that's going to be, I think, the best way to broaden the connection with the music side of the industry would be to just immerse yourself in that world as much as possible, demonstrate some familiarity with what's going on, seek out talent who has experience in that space. That's going to be a huge leg up.
Yeah, just to kind of add on what Mary Kate was saying, it's definitely something to be considered for expanding in, maybe doing as many panels as these are, and at different stuff like MagFest or something, right? Or doing something coincidentally at EGX, or whatever game conference is happening, have a panel or something like this so the education and the advocacy is continued and spread along. And so there's a lot of them. And so there's a lot of opportunity to at least have one panel at every show, or if you can possibly do that, probably better to do it virtually than in person. But at least having that there will expand the knowledge, and everybody will learn and grow together. And that way we're all having the same conversation, and we're a little bit up to speed, and we're all communicating together.
Yep, I 100% agree. I think one of the key ones that maybe we probably could have talked about more, but you're right, there's so many of them. But the game developer conferences are just really valuable opportunities. One, they're fun because if you're a nerd like I am, you literally get to play games all day, and that's my job for that 3 days. It's kind of amazing. But I think I've made so many, friends and opened up so many doors and opportunities, like even with the VR gaming space, with the Oculus Connect event that happened. There's just so much. There's so many cool people to meet. That's really what it boils down to. And once you start making those friends and those connections, you can start, building those collaborations and coming up with cool, unique ways and ideas. So, Mary Kate, Chase, I really appreciate your time. You guys have been incredible and have shared so much knowledge. I hope we get a chance to do it again. Oh, we do have one question if you guys are okay with. It looks like we got one from Kaglar, I hope I said this right, Sahin. They're actually kind of a little bit talking about the video game music concerts. That's something that, we personally, 99 Lives, have not delved into, but I do know that labels such as Monster Cat have really worked hard to do that in the VR space and in games like Fortnite. I'm not sure if you guys have any personal experience with those, or what that looks like, those types of relationships and conversations.
Well, from my end, yes, actually, but from the other side, where it's people who want to hear music in the games, but in that live concert setting. And it is a very, very, I think, important and undertapped opportunity that game music I would love to see more of. In this case, it's a little bit different from the independent label side. So I don't know if it would fit this particular discussion today, but yes, I would love to talk more about the importance of integrating game music into live performances. It's a lot of fun. Those are some of the most fun concerts I've ever been to.
Yeah, likewise. I'd love to have my music performed in a video game music conference. It's one of my dreams.
A lot of composers do, yeah.
Yeah, so I've only attended it and been thinking how can I even figure this out, and even came to the point of this last year just figuring out how to do it myself even before COVID, just to kind of hey, I'm just going to perform my music at this college over here. These children like video games, right? They're going to they don't really know, but they can get introduced to it, and then they can go further. It can teach them more. So a DIY approach, and that was what I was going to do. But yeah, I'd love to partner with and do more of that stuff and get involved. That'd be super great.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of opportunity there. And I think we've talked a little bit about doing a future panel that really focuses on what those conversations look like. Who do you approach? How does that start? How do you even get set up, right, on the technical aspect? And I don't think we have a set date or a set number of panelists, but I do know that it's a common question that's being asked right now. And I think that we are definitely considering doing a more focused talk on that. So awesome. So thank you. I think that's all we have for questions. Yep. Again, really, truly appreciate how much knowledge you guys have and how much you've shared with us. There's so much more to cover, but it's been amazing talking to you both. So thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.
So just echoing Heather, thanks all around. Thanks so much, Chase, Mary Kate, and thank you again, Heather, for volunteering to moderate, all the great questions. I want to thank our members for coming out and participating, and non-members alike. Again, if you're interested in learning more about what we do, you can reach myself, the rest of the membership team, at membership@a2im.org. And once again, quick last thank you to our sponsors, the Clio Awards. So Thanks all, and we will see you next time.